Hello there. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Yonge University Subway Line. This line was the first subway in Toronto and Canada, and is arguably the most important line in the city, being the most used and overcrowded line in the city. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. The origins of the Yonge subway can be traced back to its time as the Yonge streetcar. The Yonge streetcar in its later years was carrying around 14,000 passengers per hour and was in desperate need of replacement. Even by 1924, one could see upwards of a dozen two-car streetcars coming in either direction along Yonge Street. The first real proposal for some sort of subway under Yonge Street, however, can be found in 1909. On April 29, 1909, it was reported in the Evening Telegram that representatives from Toronto's engineering department had met with representatives from a British syndicate to discuss the construction of a streetcar subway in Toronto. The syndicate would propose two lines, one under Yonge Street from Eglinton to Front Street, and another one from East Toronto to West Toronto, running under Queen Street, Dufferin Street, and Dundas Street. These discussions were brought on by the fact that at this time relations between the City of Toronto and the Toronto Railway Company, which operated the city's streetcar network, had been deteriorating. The TRC refused to expand its service into the newly annexed areas of Toronto as they were not outlined within the original 1891 charter, and this belief would be affirmed by the courts. The city would set up a special committee to look at the proposal in June of 1909. The Mayor of Toronto, who sat on the committee, would state, "If we cannot get the railways we want on the surface, we can do so in the tubes." A preliminary report would be submitted to Toronto City Council. In this report, it was predicted the project would cost $5 million. This project would be debated for 4 hours at the November 23rd council meeting, where it was decided to put the project to a referendum. For the 1910 municipal election, the residents of Toronto would be asked, "Are you in favor of the City of Toronto applying to the legislature for power to construct and operate a municipal system of subway and surfaced street railway subject to the approval of qualified ratepayers?" This referendum would pass by a vote of 19,268 for and 10,697 against. This would not matter, however, as George R. Geary would win the mayor's race and he opposed the subway plan due to its cost. The city, however, would continue to look at the construction of a streetcar subway in Toronto, and in 1910 would call upon an American engineer, James Forgey, of the Jacobs and Davies Company in New York to come up with a plan. James would submit his report to City Council on September 10, 1910, and in it would call for a $23 million network consisting of 3 lines originating from a point at Front Street and Yonge Street. One line would travel to the northeast to Broadview and Danforth, another would travel to the northwest to Keele and Bloor. Both of these lines would follow new arterial roads. Lastly, a third line was to be constructed under Bay Street to St. Clair Avenue. This plan, however, would not happen, though, as the city's assistant engineer, E.L. Cousins, would report to City Council in November of 1911 that the northeasterly and northwesterly lines could not be constructed without the corresponding roads, which themselves may not have been possible to build. Cousins would instead alter the plan with one line traveling under Queen Street from High Park to Woodbine Avenue, while another line would travel under Bloor Street from High Park to Broadview Avenue. The two lines would then be linked together, forming a loop line. It is worth pointing out that it may be this plan that spurred Thomas Taylor to design the lower deck under the Bloor Viaduct. The city would put out a tender to begin construction of the line under Bay Street in the fall of 1911. This tender, however, was only for the tunnel and not the tracks or signals. The lowest bid came in at $2.6 million. This expense would be put to a referendum on January 1, 1912. However, this time the voters were not too keen on the idea. This referendum would fail by a vote of 8,486 for and 11,291 against. Support for subway development in Toronto would fade after this, and Chicago traction expert Brian J. Arnold would report in 1912 that subways should be looked upon in the nature of a last resort, a necessity forced by conditions for which there was no other remedy. Toronto does not at present need subways nearly so much as it needs more surface tracks and more and better faster service cars. Brian would go on to state that Toronto's current transit woes could be summed up into three main issues, those being 1. Poor track maintenance, as the TRC had been cutting back to save money in the final years of its charter. 2. Low streetcar speeds, which Brian believed could be remedied by eliminating the use of trailer cars and better track conditions. And 3. Congestion on heavily used routes, especially Yonge Street. Brian believed too many lines were using Yonge Street, and so routes should be moved onto other roads such as Torrolly, which is now Bay Street, as well as Church Street and Victoria Street. Brian would say, however, that if the city and the TRC could not work out an agreement, then the city could build a line under Yonge Street, looping via Queen Street, Bay Street, and Temperance Street, then traveling north to St. Clair Avenue with a branch under Bloor Street to Broadview Avenue. Into the 1920s, ridership on the Yonge streetcar would continue to increase, and in 1931, Horatio C. Hawken, who sat on the Toronto Board of Control and had been an avid subway supporter all the way back to 1909, would propose a streetcar subway under Avenue Road, from St. Clair Avenue to a loop via Front Street, Scott Street, Victoria Street, and Gerrard Street. This plan would be rejected by the TTC as it was not justified on economic grounds. The TTC would propose their own plan in October of 1941, which called for a streetcar subway under Bay Street as well as one under Queen Street. This line under Yonge Street would run from a loop via York Street and Front Street. The line would then travel north on Bay Street and then jog east under Ramsden Park. The line would then travel north to a point just north of St. Clair Avenue. The line would also include connections to the Bay streetcar and DuPont streetcar, as well as a branch into the town of Forest Hill and the township of York via the abandoned Beltline Railway. This plan would be rejected by the city as being too complicated, but requested the TTC come back with a simpler plan. The TTC would do so, coming back with a plan that retained the streetcar subway under Queen Street, but now called for a Chicago-style heavy rail subway under Yonge Street, running from Eglinton Avenue to Union Station. This plan would be put to a referendum on January 1st, 1946, with voters being asked, "Are you in favor of the Toronto Transportation Commission proceeding with the proposed rapid transit system, provided the Dominion government assume 1/5 of the cost and provided that the cost to the ratepayers is limited to such amounts as the City Council may agree are necessary for the replacement and improvement of the city services?" In layman's terms, the city was looking for the federal government to assume 20% of the cost, while the TTC would pay the rest through its fare box revenue. This referendum would pass by a vote of 69,935 for and 8,360 against. Toronto City Council would then approve the plan on April 16, 1946. With this, Toronto would finally get its subway. While the original plan did call for the federal government to pay 20% of the cost, this would not happen as the federal government and provincial government failed to agree on a post-war employment program that would support the project. Because of this, the plan was scaled down in that the Queen Street subway was put on hold to a later date and only the Yonge subway would be built for now. This would reduce the cost of the project from $42.3 million, which is the equivalent of $641.8 million today, to $28.9 million, which is about $438.5 million today. Plus an additional $3.5 million, which is $53.1 million today for rolling stock. In total, the Yonge Subway was estimated to cost $32.4 million, which is about $491.6 million today. This line would have 12 stops and run from Eglinton Avenue to Union Station, with additional stops at Davisville, St. Clair, Summerhill, Rosedale, Bloor, Wellesley, College, Dundas, Queen, and King. Construction of the line commenced on September 8, 1949, which was 2 years late due to post-war shortages of supplies. The underground portion of the line would be constructed using the cut and cover method, as this would be cheaper than a tunnel bore. A large trench would be dug and then decked over to allow for continued use by vehicular traffic. At this time as well, the Yonge streetcar would be diverted onto neighboring roads. A total of 1.3 million cubic meters of material was removed during the construction and would be dumped into Lake Ontario by Ashbridges Bay, forming part of what is today the Leslie Street Spit. North of Front Street, crews would encounter solid rock, 3 to 8 feet in depth, stretching as far north as Queen Street. Crews would use dynamite charges to blast away the rock, with these blasts occurring twice a day, once at noon and then again at 4:30 p.m. Construction of the line would proceed without much event, except for flooding south of Adelaide Street due to a storm sewer giving way after a heavy storm on June 24, 1950. At some points, the water could be as much as 20 feet deep. The line would run underground from Union Station to a point just north of Bloor Street, where it would come to the surface in an open-cut trench. It should be noted, however, that original plans for the line actually had the trench extending south to Alexander Street just north of College Street. I cannot say, however, if both Bloor and Wellesley stations were to be open stations like Rosedale, or if they would have been underground as they are today. Either way, it was decided that this part of the line should remain underground as a means to reduce expropriations and to ease fears that the trench would hurt property values. The open-cut trench that was built would extend from a point just north of Bloor Street to a point just south of Eglinton Avenue, although both St. Clair and Summerhill stations would remain underground. By contrast, Rosedale and Davisville stations would be out in the open. The open cut between Summerhill and St. Clair stations would be decked over in the late 60s and early 70s. Queen Station would be built with a roughed-in streetcar platform underneath it in preparation for the Queen Street Subway. The Yonge Line would be served by Davisville Yard, which was located on the site of the Alexander Muir Memorial Garden, which was relocated to St. Edmunds Drive at a cost of $100,000. The stations along the line would be constructed in a basic style built on the principle of being functional with little thought given to style itself, although the stations themselves would be finished with vitrolite tiles, which gave the stations a particularly glossy look to them and would give rise to the joke that the Toronto subway was the world's longest bathroom. In regards to rolling stock, the TTC at first looked towards New York and Chicago for ideas and heavily considered using Chicago's 6000 series cars, which were built by the St. Louis Car Company and made with salvaged PCC parts. Early drawings of the line also show the subway using trains in this style and even having the PCC's red and cream livery. The TTC would, however, look elsewhere, as the cost to build these trains was too high for the TTC's liking, and they would eventually settle on the Gloucester Railway Carriage and Wagon Company in Gloucester, England. These cars would be based off of what was used on the London Underground, and the TTC would place an order for 104 cars in November of 1951 at a cost of $7.8 million, which is about $81.2 million today. The first cars would arrive at the Port of Montreal in 1953 and then be shipped by rail to the Hillcrest shops. All future deliveries would go to the Davisville Yard via a CN rail spur along the abandoned Beltline Railway. After 5 years of construction, the Yonge Subway would officially open on March 30th, 1954. Opening ceremonies were held at Davisville Station, with the event being attended by Premier Leslie Frost, Toronto Mayor Alan Lamport, Metro Chairman Frederick Gardner, and TTC Chairman William McBrien. During his speech, TTC Chairman William McBrien would call for the immediate commencement of the Queen Street Subway, as well as other measures to combat downtown traffic, including fringe parking lots, one-way streets, and staggered work hours. McBrien would go on to say that the Yonge Subway was not the final solution to Toronto's traffic problems. It is only the start of combating this monster. Many other rapid transit lines will have to be built in the future. And that the TTC would not be able to build these lines on their own without government support. Over 600 dignitaries would participate in the first ride, with the journey from Eglinton Station to Union Station taking only 14 minutes. By comparison, a streetcar ride from Eglinton to Union could take up to half an hour if traffic was good. The subway would officially open to the public at 1:30 p.m. People who took the streetcar to work would take the subway home. Both the Yonge and Bay streetcars would be abolished with the opening of the subway, and the Church streetcar would follow 2 months later due to the higher electrical demands of the subway causing brownouts in the area. The St. Clair streetcar would also be realigned to terminate at the newly built St. Clair station. The subway would be an instant success, with riders flocking to the line. Originally, the line was to operate with 2-car trains during the off-peak hours. However, this was quickly phased out, and 4-car trains became the minimum, with 6-car trains being the standard. For a time, the line even operated 8-car Gloucester trains. After the opening and success of the Yonge Subway, the City of Toronto began looking at what should be done next. What was to be done next was an east-west subway line. Originally, Queen Street was the planned route. However, the situation by this point had changed, and Bloor and Danforth became the preferred east-west corridor. You can learn more about this in my video about the Bloor-Danforth subway. With Bloor and Danforth now the preferred corridor for the east-west line, the TTC would also make a case for extending the Yonge line west to meet the planned Bloor-Danforth subway at a second point. The TTC would say that the extension would give access to the various commercial, financial, and government institutions along University Avenue, as well as relieve possible congestion at Bloor Station by creating another transfer point between the two lines. At this time, the Yonge line was beginning to use 8-car trains as standard practice, and the TTC realized that without another transfer point, Bloor Station would be the sole interchange and thus would have to bear the entire load of riders coming from both the east and the west. This extension was estimated to cost $45 million, which is about $413.2 million today, and would have been built as Phase 1 of the Bloor-Danforth project. The extension itself would be built entirely underground and have 6 new stations. However, to avoid confusion with the stations on Yonge Street, these new stations would feature unique names. These stations being St. Andrew, Osgood, St. Patrick, Queen's Park, Museum, and St. George. These stations do, however, bear their respective street names as a subtitle. The extension would also be the first in Toronto to make use of tunnel boring, as the line from Osgood to Museum utilized bored tunnel. This was done to mitigate disruption along University Avenue, which is home to various hospitals and the Ontario Legislature. As well, due to this method of construction, Queen's Park and St. Patrick stations are the only 2 in Toronto to be entirely bored. While I can't say for certain, I believe utility relocation work was done under Osgood Station to allow a line to pass underneath it, although no actual platforms were built, unlike at Queen Station. Lastly, the stations along this extension would be fitted with generic ceramic tiles, as vitrolite had fallen out of favor and was no longer produced. As well, since vitrolite tiles are essentially glass, they are easily damaged and can become cracked and or broken entirely. The University extension would open on February 28, 1963, and the subway would then be referred to as the Yonge University Line. In 1966, with the opening of the Bloor-Danforth subway, the two lines would be interlined for a period of 6 months. The University Extension and the Bloor-Danforth lines were constructed with a large underground Y to allow trains to transfer between the two lines. During this 6-month period, trains would operate on the two lines, with, for example, trains running from Eglinton to Keele and then from Keele to Woodbine. Trains would then head back to Eglinton Station via Lower Bay. The opposite would hold true for trains running from Eglinton to Woodbine first. After 6 months, this experiment was ended and the two lines were segregated, as this arrangement was far easier to operate. Ridership on the extension was slow at the start and failed to meet expectations. Trains would often be short-turned at Union Station, as people simply preferred to use the Yonge line since it was closer to their destinations. In fact, ridership on this extension was so low that on June 23, 1969, the TTC would institute a policy that would see the University Extension closed after 9:45 p.m. from Monday to Saturday and closed all day Sunday. Service after the closure would be operated by the 5 Avenue Road bus. This service pattern would be in place until the Spadina extension opened in 1978. With the opening of the Bloor-Danforth subway in 1966, Metro Toronto had achieved its goals and now began looking to the next phase of projects. While the City of Toronto pushed hard for the Queen Street subway, the suburbs were also beginning to make noise. In this case, for the end to the fare zone system and better bus service. For the TTC, the years of construction had taken a toll on their finances, and increased car usage meant the TTC was now relying on more and more assistance from Metro Toronto. In this regard, Metro Toronto was gaining more control over TTC affairs. At the time, Chairman of Metro Council Frederick Gardner saw that extending the current network into the suburbs would be much easier and more politically popular than building a whole new line from scratch. The idea of a northern extension of the Yonge line goes back to 1959 when Metro Toronto looked at extending the line to Sheppard. This plan, however, would take a backseat to the proposed extension to be built in conjunction with the proposed Spadina Expressway. Plans changed, however, on September 16, 1965, when a planning report went to Metro Council calling for the extension along Yonge Street to be given priority as there was uncertainty over the Spadina Expressway's alignment. In 1961, Metro Toronto studied the possibility of extending the subway north to Steeles Avenue. This study looked at constructing the extension in 2 phases. Phase 1 would be a 5-stop extension from Eglinton to Sheppard, with stops at Glencairn, Lawrence, Glen Echo, York Mills, and Sheppard. This extension would open in 1970. Phase 2 would see the line extended to Steeles Avenue with an additional 4 stops at Empress, Finch, Cummer, and Steeles. Construction of this extension was to begin in 1980. The line would also cross the Don River between York Mills and Sheppard on a low-level bridge. In total, it was estimated this extension would cost $100.6 million, which is about $894.5 million today. The extension of the Yonge line wasn't without merit, as there was considerable traffic north of Eglinton, and North York was growing rapidly and looking to establish its own downtown core. Metro Council would ultimately approve of the extension to Sheppard Avenue on January 25, 1967. The extension approved, however, would not be based off of the 1961 report, but off of another report done in 1964, which had a few key differences. The stations at Glencairn, Glen Echo, and Empress would be dropped as a cost-cutting measure. As well, the subway would now cross the Don River on a high-level viaduct, with York Mills Station being elevated above the valley in what was described as a significant engineering and architectural achievement. Finally, the TTC did not support the line traveling north to Steeles Avenue, as the towns of Vaughan and Markham did not have the water and sewer infrastructure in place to support the development that would inevitably follow. The project would attract controversy, with local ratepayers objecting to the loss of 275 homes and residents objecting to the bridge over the Don River, citing potential losses to property values. Bear in mind, however, that Highway 401 also crosses through the same area, so do with that information what you will. Because of this, the extension would be realigned under Yonge Street, and the subway would now go under the Don River instead of over it. While this would save $1.6 million in property acquisition costs, it would increase the complications in building the line and further inflate the budget, so there was ultimately no savings to be had, and we ended up paying more in the end. Construction of the extension would begin on October 3, 1968, with the extension having an estimated cost of $79.6 million, which is about $574.9 million today, and had an opening date of 1972. On October 17, 1969, Metro Toronto would approve a further one-stop extension of the line to Finch Avenue. This extension was spurred on by the existence of a hydro corridor north of Finch Avenue, which could be used for commuter parking lots. This extension would meet protests from the borough of North York, which objected to the lack of the Empress Station. The extension would be built with the provision for a station there in the future, however. This provision would be made use of in 1987 when North York Centre Station opened. Construction of this extension would be met with complications and problems. The construction of York Mill Station in particular was a particular headache, as the station had to be built under a flowing river. To do so, the Don River was temporarily diverted, and the station built beneath it was built to different standards. Specifically, the station was built with 1.2 meter thick walls and 2.4 meter thick floors. By comparison, standard stations only have 0.5 meter thick walls and 0.6 meter thick floors. The TTC describes York Mill Station as a concrete island that floats below the Don River West Branch. Other issues included finding quicksand at Teddington Park Avenue and wet soil conditions in Hoggs Hollow. Lastly, there was also a labor strike that occurred at that time as well. All of this combined meant that the extension was months behind schedule, and so it was decided that the extension would open as far as York Mill Station on March 31, 1973. The opening of this extension would include a large ceremony that included 400 dignitaries, including the Mayor of Toronto, David Crombie, and Mayor of North York, Mel Lastman. The extension would open to the public the next day. The extension of the line to Finch would open a year later on March 30th, 1974. While all of that was going on along Yonge Street, Metro Toronto was also making moves on extending the western end of the Yonge University Line. Dating back to the 1950s, Metro Toronto looked at integrating a subway line with its proposed Spadina Expressway. By the time the 1960s came around, this plan was coming around, although it would be pushed off in favor of the Yonge extension due to uncertainties over the alignment of the Spadina Expressway. The City of Toronto at this time was still pushing its Queen Street subway idea, however by this point political power on Metro Council had shifted. The provincial government had amalgamated Metro Toronto's 13 municipalities into 6, and with this the balance of power on Metro Council shifted from the urban core to the suburbs. The idea would be inspired by the Blue Line in Chicago, which runs along the Eisenhower Expressway. The extension, however, wasn't without critics who saw it as a Trojan horse, as a way to make the Spadina Expressway more palatable, as it was becoming increasingly unpopular as time went on. Others saw the alignment of the line down the middle of a highway as wasted potential and not justifying of its potential ridership. When the Spadina Expressway was ultimately cancelled, the subway alignment did not change all that much, with the segment of the extension of the line between Eglinton West and DuPont planning to be at grade. This, however, was met with opposition by the City of Toronto and the Borough of York, which opposed running the subway at grade through the Nordimer Ravine. Instead, the City of Toronto and the Borough of York proposed that the extension be built under Bathurst Street, either all the way to Wilson Avenue or to at least St. Clair Avenue where it could join the expressway. It would ultimately be decided to bury the extension under the ravine, although this didn't exactly please everyone. Some still pushed for the extension to be built under either Bathurst Street or Dufferin Street, as those two roads had far higher density and ridership potential. Either way, the alignment that was ultimately chosen would see the Yonge University Line extended 8 stops from St. George Station to Wilson, with stops at Lowther, DuPont, St. Clair West, Eglinton West, Glencairn, Lawrence West, Yorkdale, and Wilson. This extension was approved on January 18, 1973, with an estimated cost of $80 million, which is about $600.4 million today. This extension would see a big change in the design principles of subway stations in Toronto. Instead of the old utilitarian design of stations, this extension would seek to emulate the artistic atmosphere of the Montreal Metro, with each station having its own unique design and art piece. Lowther Station would become Spadina Station, although it was originally planned to be a completely distinct and separate station. Eventually, it was decided to connect Lowther Station and Spadina Station along the Bloor-Danforth line together via an underground walkway, thus creating the Spadina Station we know today. This long hallway would feature a moving walkway, although this would eventually be taken out due to maintenance costs. This extension would also see the construction of Wilson Yard. This yard would become the largest in the subway network and the main heavy maintenance center for the Yonge University Line, as well as the eventual Shepherd Line. The extension was planned to open on October 15, 1977. However, an electrician's strike delayed the installation of the signaling system. Because of this, the extension would not open until January 27, 1978. As well, with the opening of this extension, the line would be known as the Yonge University Spadina Line. As expected though, the line's ridership wasn't all that great, although it did meet the TTC's proposed 8,000 riders per day. Many criticized the extension, although supporters defended it as a long-term investment and for bringing rapid transit to the northwestern side of Metro Toronto. When all was said and done, this extension would ultimately cost $212 million, which is about $1.5 billion today. The Yonge University Spadina Line would remain quiet until the early 90s, when it would be extended once again. Into the 1980s, the province of Ontario began to promote its Network 2011 plan, which among other things called for a subway along Shepherd Avenue and for the Yonge University Spadina Line to be extended to meet it. This plan would see the line extended at least one stop to Shepherd Avenue and a station that would be known as Downsview. At first, this was to be the terminus of the line. However, eventually the scope of the project increased and there began talks of extending the line beyond Downsview to York University. There eventually became talks of a further extension beyond to Steeles Avenue and then having the line travel east to Yonge Street, where it would then connect to an extension of the Yonge portion of the line, forming a loop line. With the fall of the Conservatives in 1985 and the Liberals under David Peterson, the Liberals at this time did not wish to pay for Network 2011 due to its cost, and there was much debate over what should be done. Debate in this case centered on whether or not the Shepherd Line should be built first, or if an extension of the Yonge Line to York University was more appropriate. Either way, between these two plans, Downsview Station was a common factor, and so it was decided to at the very least get that built, even if it was just to buy time. The extension to Downsview, however, was met with criticism, with it being called a subway from nowhere to nowhere. However, since this was the only project the Liberals were willing to fund, Metro Toronto decided to support the project on April 26, 1989. Construction of the extension to Downsview would take a lot longer than normal, however, as the TTC and Metro would first have to clear the hurdle that was Downsview Airport, which at the time was an Air Force base. The Canadian Forces would veto 2 alignments as they came too close to munitions storage and disposal facilities. The TTC had wanted the original Downsview station to be at an east-west alignment, as this would allow an easier connection and possible interlining of the Yonge Line and the Sheppard Line. This, however, would require the line swing under the airport. Eventually, it was decided that Downsview station would be at a north-south orientation, as this would not have to deal with the airport and would also allow for a future northern extension. Construction of the extension would finally commence on June 22, 1992, with Downsview Station opening on March 30, 1996. This extension would ultimately cost $117 million. That's $196.1 million today. The most recent extension of the line would come in 2017 with the opening of the Toronto-York extension. This extension would see the Yonge Line extended 6 stops from Downsview Station to Vaughan Metropolitan Centre, with stops at Downsview Park, Finch West, York University, Pioneer Village, Highway 407, and Vaughan Metropolitan Centre. The origins of this plan, however, date back to the 1980s, as mentioned before. As previously mentioned, in 1989, provincial planners looked at extending both arms of the Yonge University line to the Finch Hydro Corridor, then connecting both branches, forming a loop line. Additional stations would have been built at Bathurst Street, Dufferin Street, and Sheppard Avenue, which would become Downsview Station. The methodology behind this idea was that it would eliminate the need for both the Downtown Relief Line and the Sheppard Subway, as now riders could simply go over the top of the line to get between the two branches. This plan was met with fierce opposition and mockery. Critics looking at the subway under the Hydro Corridor wondered if the groundhogs were the intended passengers. Mayor of North York, Mel Lastman, opposed the plan as he was a strong proponent of the Sheppard Subway. This sentiment would be echoed by politicians in Scarborough, which would gain absolutely nothing from this plan while losing out on the Sheppard Subway. Toronto would also oppose this plan, as many still pushed for the Downtown Relief Line. York University and politicians from York Region, however, were more open to the plan, but only if the subway ran under Steeles Avenue. Eventually, however, the Liberals would be replaced by the NDP, which supported the extension of the subway to York University. However, due to the recession at the time, Metro Toronto could not support all of the proposed subway plans at the time and decided to put the extensions to York University, as well as an extension of the Scarborough RT to Markham Road, on the shelf in favor of focusing on the Sheppard and Eglinton West lines. Talks about an extension of the line beyond Downsview would die down until 2000, when the city of Vaughan put out its plan to build a downtown core at Jane Street and Highway 7. This development would be anchored by an extension of the subway to Vaughan. York University would join Vaughan in its support for the project. Vaughan would propose paying for the line north of Steeles Avenue and lobbied MPPs to get funding support for the project. In 2005, York Region and the province would propose an extension of the Yonge segment of the line to Langstaff, and for a very brief time it was considered linking the two halves of the Yonge University line along Highway 7. Hope would grow further with the election of the Liberals under Dalton McGuinty, and specifically his Minister of Finance Greg Sobara, who represented that area's riding. Public consultations and environmental assessments would be done for an extension from Downsview to Steeles, and further studies would finalize the extension from Steeles to Highway 7. On March 23, 2006, the provincial government would announce $670 million in funding for the project, which would pay for 1/3 of the cost. The cities of Toronto and Vaughan would pay another third, while the final third would come from the federal government. Construction of the extension would begin in 2010. By 2015, however, the project had become delayed and $400 million over budget due to a variety of reasons. These included bad weather and colder than normal winters, a fatal accident at York University Station which closed the site for multiple months due to an investigation. There was also a large issue of contractors not meeting deadlines and the TTC's management of its projects. The extension would open on December 15, 2017, with ceremonies being held at Vaughan Metropolitan Centre Station. As of the making of this video, there are currently plans for an extension of the Yonge Line into Richmond Hill. This idea itself is not new and dates back into 2007 when the idea was first proposed, with this proposal seeing the line extended 5 stops from Finch Station to Richmond Hill Centre, with stops at Cummer, Steeles, Clark, Royal Orchard, and Richmond Hill Centre. This plan would also have seen the bridge over the Don River rebuilt with a lower deck to allow the subways to cross. The proposal, however, never went anywhere and died out until around 2014 when it was resurrected by Metrolinx. There was, however, a caveat to this plan in that this extension could not open until the Downtown Relief Line did. This extension was estimated to have cost $5.6 billion. Regardless, planning still continues on this extension, with it now having been altered as of the making of this video. Alterations to this plan include a reduction in the number of stops, with Cummer, Clark, and Royal Orchard all being on the chopping block. Metrolinx is only planning to build one, although they haven't decided which one yet. The extension does, however, also call for a new station south of the Highway 407 called Bridge. Lastly, as of very recently, it seems Metrolinx is looking at going under the Don River instead of over it. So we have a bunch of mid-block stations being cut and a subway line being built under a river instead of over it. It's almost like this has happened before. Regardless, as it currently stands, this version of the extension is estimated to cost $9.3 billion. The Yonge University Line was Toronto's and Canada's first subway line. The line was born out of a need to replace an overcapacity streetcar line. The subway itself has fallen victim to the very same overcrowding as the streetcar it replaced. Over its years, the line has been continually extended further into the suburbs, while little has been done to address the crowding issues on the line. Bloor and Union stations have both been expanded since opening, and the TTC is currently installing an ATC system on the line to allow trains to operate more frequently. However, these are simply band-aid solutions and are simply treating the symptoms but not the problem itself. As well, arguments can be made about certain extensions of the line. Should the Spadina extension have been built under Bathurst Street or Dufferin Street instead of along the highway? Should York Mill Station have been built elevated above the Don River instead of under it? Should the stations at Glencairn and Gled Echo have been built? Should the extension to Vaughan have been built at all? Hell, why is the extension even underground north of Steeles? In regards to the extension into Richmond Hill, which stations should be built? And moreover, why are we considering burying the line under the Don River again? We did this exact same thing when we extended the Yonge Line to Sheppard and put York Mill Station below the river instead of above it, while at the same time cutting multiple mid-block stations. This is, in essence, history repeating itself. The Yonge University Line has a storied history, although you can look at the line as having some questionable decisions being made about it, and if the line as it exists today is the most optimal way it should, or if it could have been done better. I will, however, let you ponder those questions, as this is where I will end the video. Thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it and want to see more like it, please subscribe, because there are more videos like it on the channel and there are more videos like it on the way. If there's anything you want to say about the Yonge University Subway Line, don't be afraid to do so in the comments section down below. And with that, I'll see you in the next video.